Well, good afternoon, everyone. Only weeks and weeks away from the Feast of Tabernacles. A week and a half is trumpets already. Can you imagine if Jesus Christ actually came on trumpets this year? Would that surprise a lot of people? You sure bet. You wonder about that if you think you're ready or not. Because we're not promised tomorrow, are we? All right. I'm pretty happy today about my sermon. I'm glad I got here to hear it. No, I'm just kidding you. Today's going to be more of a Bible study style. And actually, that's what I like to do. If I had my rathers of a sermon versus a Bible study, I'd do a Bible study any day. And I do miss from time to time at the Feast of Tabernacles, because I travel and you got to do a message each time you go, is the interaction between the brethren and the study and the questions and answers, because there's so much feedback that comes back and forth. So, for example, now I'm going to start the sermon message. So I bring this up now, 1917 to 1967. It's 50 years. If I was doing the Bible study, I'd go around the room. What comes to your mind? You see, everybody's got a thought comes to your mind. But what if God put this together to tell us a story? What if this was a shadow of an event that you're living in right now? I was going through some studies of the series I've been working on for the last 8 years. And all of a sudden, just something jumped out at me. I'll use Chuck's phrase when he says you come across the scripture and it kind of just jumps on you. Or jumps out at you. All of a sudden, something just jumped out at me. That what I thought I was seeing in my mind of all the things we've gone through was the physical template. The physical template covered 50 years. And so I sat back and I was just absorbing my thoughts, trying to understand what it was I was seeing. And the more I looked into the understanding God has given to us over the last specifically 8 years, the clearer and clearer things got. So I want to bring this out to you today in a two-part message here. It's called 1917 and 1967, God's Plan of Salvation for Mankind. These years may be the most significant years in modern times until now. And I mean that with all my heart. So what I'm going to share with you today is two aspects of this. The physical and the biblical that God's leading us to the end time. All right? So, God's plan for salvation. They may be, these are the 50 years, they may be the beginning of what the Bible tells us is the fig tree season. I remember when I was traveling, we were doing the Blood Moon Tetrads, and we were doing the book that I had written and the TV specials we had actually ran them on 3 networks at the time. I had a chance to sit down with some of what they call in the world today, some of the leading prophecy experts in the Protestant world, the evangelical world out there. And one of the conversations came up about the fig tree season. And they couldn't agree when the fig tree season began. And actually, I thought about it and from the church, and I always thought, well, it was always the end time. Because that's what Jesus says. And you look at Matthew 24, and you see all these things begin to happen, and you'll know, like a fig tree, summer's near, when these things begin to happen. And so as they argued, they actually brought up points I had not considered. We were sitting around the table. There was I think there was 8 of us at the time. Each one of them had a television network that they were on. And so, I was the guest, so I just kind of kept my mouth shut and listened for the most part. Every now and then I'd make a comment. But it started me thinking, because we actually had Bill Salas on our program, on one of his TV specials. And Bill Salas believed it was a certain period of time. If I'm correct, I think it was 1948. So many people in the argument think it was 1948 because it was the state of Israel was established. That was the beginning of the fig tree season, because that's where God began to bring his people back to Israel and began to unite Well, Israel wasn't united yet. In fact, that's, in their mind, that's an anti-Semitism comment, which is kind of strange when you think about it. So anyway, all these things come together, but the Bible actually has a place that I want to bring out today because it falls in these 50 years. There's others that think it's 1967 because that's when they finally took control of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the type of Jesus Christ coming, standing on the Mount of Olives. So they believe that that's the time. But what does the Bible actually say? What if there's a way that we can determine from Scripture when the fig tree season is? They were the 50 years, the beginning of the gathering of his elect the second time, which is spoken of by Isaiah 11:11, which I'll cover in just a moment. So all of this together falls into the 50 years. We also know when we look at a 50-year period as a jubilee. And so in a jubilee cycle, you have 7 sevens, and the 50th, which is a year of release or year of freedom. And we know that Jesus Christ pictured the time when he comes and he releases the captives, heals the sick, the lame walk, the blind see. We know all these things fit into it, and every one of those things I just mentioned are the type within this 50 years. All of that lines up perfectly. So now let's take a look at this. What I'm going to show you here, I believe, is a blueprint. So it's a blueprint. So as I was going through my template in my mind, this physical template, I said it's a blueprint that God's got. And I'm in my mind, and I'm thinking, and I'm trying to pray, and there was many nights I'd be up in the middle of the night, and then I wake up and I think about this blueprint that God had. I said, could God actually have a blueprint for a specific time that we can actually look at, to put down? So I began to go through scriptures to think about this blueprint. So today I'm going to talk about God's blueprint, this end time 50 years, the period of the fig tree beginning to develop, from World War I to the Six-Day War. Because this is what you're looking at here. It begins with a world war, which is a type of the end time you see from Revelation, when God says that this whole world under one governance is all going to gather to do what? To fight Jesus Christ where? At Jerusalem. Armageddon, the Valley of Megiddo. So what you're looking at when you begin to put it in perspectives, all of this is lined up in type of the end time. And God has already tied it into a 50-year period. Now, let's go a little further. God's blueprint. Think about this now. Could God have actually laid out before creation a blueprint? And I've wondered from time to time in the millennium reign, if God doesn't bring us all to Jerusalem and he begins to lay out for us, and we see on the screen somewhere all that he had did from creation to build everything that he's building. God's physical template for his spiritual fulfillment. So let me explain this. A physical template for the spiritual fulfillment. Look what Amos 3 says. Scripture we should all be familiar with by now. Surely the Lord will do nothing, but he revealed his secret to his servants, the prophets. All right, the prophets, that's you and I. That's not specifically as a prophet in the Old Testament is when God comes down and talks one-on-one with. They say, go tell my people. This is the inspired messages of God. Every one of us fall within this category. All right, within this period, his servants, his elect, that God inspires and tells you like he did those prophets in the Old Testament. Because you see, each one of us have access to the throne of God through Jesus Christ now. He doesn't need to go through one person. Although God still has a plan, he has certain specifics for people that he'll use for certain things. Each one of us have a role in God's plan. But here what we're looking at here is that if indeed God has a blueprint, did he tell us in advance? that it's there? Well, let's go through that question. So what has God revealed in his blueprint? So, more importantly, how has God revealed it and told us in advance what he was doing? In other words, I want to be able to go look through here. If I was building this building, I tell you, but Danny probably does one of the best I've ever seen anybody do as far as blueprint and everything. He can actually go back. How many years we've been in the building now? Almost 30? He'll go back and I'll ask him about certain wiring, and he'll go back and pull his books out. He's got papers and pages. He takes a lot of time to lay down and do schematics on his wiring and his electric, and he'll run his things, and before you know it, he'll have an answer for what we need. Because he wired this entire building. Every light, everything in here. He did that. Sometimes he had help. Not too often. He was young and healthy then. Look what happened to him after all that work. No, I'm just kidding you. All right, so what do I look at? I open the Bible and I look at it. So where do I find the blueprint? So let's go find that blueprint that God's got in the Bible. We begin with the book of Job, believe it or not. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, and he said, remember, Job was, the condition Job was in. Minding his own business one day, Satan goes before God and says, where you been, Satan? He said, I've been going here and there. And God says, out of the blue, you consider my servant Job. Now, Job's over there minding his own business. And God says, what about Job? Well, I can't do anything to Job because you got him hedged about on all sides. Which ought to be a real blessing for you and I, because you see, you and I, we're hedged on all sides. So when you think about what Satan's doing, he can't do anything to you unless God lets him happen to do that. And that's pretty encouraging. In fact, while I'm ahead, I ought to just finish the sermon now and go sit down. You can't get any better than that. God's got you protected. So we don't have to live in fear. All right, so anyway, goes on. Now God's ready to begin to explain something. He says, who is this that darkens the counsels by words without knowledge? Now, I don't know how you feel about it, thinking about God coming down on you, one-on-one. This had to be kind of frightening for Job. All of a sudden, God talks to him out of a whirlwind, and now he's about to lay down the law. Gird up your loins like a man, and I'm going to demand of you if you have an answer. He says, I want you to tell me now if you can answer these questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if you have understanding. He laid the foundations of the earth. He did what? He set a blueprint out. And in that blueprint, he laid out the foundations. So maybe in the kingdom, we'll be able to go sit down and God will show us, let me tell you how I did that. And then he'll begin to lay it all out, step by step. And 1,000 years later, he says, and that's how I did it. And you and I won't be any older than we were than he first began to tell us. 1,000 years before. It's in the blueprint. He goes on. Who has laid the measures thereof? Do you know, Job? He said, what about it, Job? Tell me about that. Who has stretched the line upon it? And then he gets really exciting here. And watch verse 6. Where were you when the foundations thereof were fastened? When God hung that earth out there and he set it in place, he fastened it so it can't move. It's going to stay there. Where were you, Job, when I did all of that? He opens up his blueprints, he rolls them out and says, look, it's right there. Where were you when I did that? Or laid the cornerstone thereof, he says. And when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Because see, this is what they saw. When you look at the skies, you look at the planets, the moons, the meteorites, the asteroids, barrenness, rocks. But all of a sudden, this showed up. And all the angels sang for joy. And God had a plan. He laid it out in a blueprint. It was a physical template of what he was going to build for you and I. So what does it mean then to have a physical template for spiritual fulfillment? Well, Hebrews tells us there's a heavenly and there's the earthly. Because I then began to ask myself the question a few weeks ago. It's like, is it possible that there is actually a physical template that God laid out that we can go look at? So then you go to the Bible and say, well, if there was, then God had to have some kind of example so that we can justify that it does exist. So you go to Hebrews and it says there's the heavenly and then there's the earthly. All right, then you go to, it says they serve as the copy, this is the scriptures. They show it as the copy of the shadow of the heavenly, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, see that you make all things according to the pattern showed to you in the mountain. He showed it to him. What did he do? He wrote out a blueprint. He showed Moses a plan. It was a blueprint. It was a template. He said, now when you go build it, make sure you do it exactly as I showed you. I said, okay. All right, so there's an example. We're not taking our Bible out of context. There can be a template for the end time. So I went a little further. Look at Exodus. Making the tabernacle. He says, and look that you make it after the pattern that was showed to you in the mountain. All right, so this is where Hebrews is referring to. So we know there's a template, the physical and the spiritual. How about the parables? So what does God do when we get into the spiritual? He takes the parable of the kingdom and he's likened it unto. So he takes a spiritual principle of what the kingdom is and he gives us a physical to understand what he's telling us. Because in our minds we think physical. You know, when you might have heard me tell the story, is that my first Feast of Tabernacles, I was only 20, I think it was. And I went to Big Sandy. And man, there were people everywhere. There was like 15,000 people. And it was hot. Yeah, we had a spring up there too, like 90 degrees, like Denny said. And it rained. And it rained. And they had campsites. Thousands of people camping. And they had a high and a low area. And the low area got flooded and moved everybody to the upper campsite. So there were people everywhere. Hot, wet, smelly. Now, I had only been baptized a few months, and I'm at this Feast of Tabernacles, and I'm saying, like, this is not fun. This is not what I signed up for. I thought this was the millennium. I went home after about 3 or 4 days. And my dad, who was sick, he couldn't go to the feast. He says, what are you doing back here? I said, I didn't like it. He says, you can't walk out of the kingdom. And I'm thinking like 20 years old, what do you mean walk out of the kingdom? I didn't like the feast. I came home. What are you talking? See, I didn't understand the kingdom. I didn't have anything in my mind yet of likened to. See, the parable is that he likened to the kingdom. The 12 parables, and all of them are given a physical understanding to understand the spiritual. That's how God starts working with each one of us. He's got to give us something we can grasp from a human carnal mind to be able to understand. Even the commandments, when they were given, they looked at them purely as physical. Till Jesus Christ came and gave us the spiritual significance. Although there's a couple of scriptures that you can't ever physically do. They're all spiritual, even from the Old Testament. But it wasn't understood at the time. So God, throughout the Bible, throughout creation, gives us physical to understand the spiritual. And so you go a little bit further then. God has outlaid his plan throughout the Bible in a physical format that we may, at a later time, understand the spiritual. All right, so we're all together on that. I think we can all agree with all of that. Daniel 12:9 says this, go your way, Daniel, for the words are sealed until the time of the end. So that means even though he did it, it's a physical that's out there, he doesn't let our minds see the spiritual until he said it's time. So even though it's there, even though there's a template, God says it's not for you, it's going to be for a later generation. Here's the question. Is it possible that in God's plan of salvation, that he's actually designed and put into play an end-time physical blueprint, a template to understand the spiritual that you and I are living in? And I say, yes, there is. And that's what I intend to bring out to you today. The physical template of God's plan of salvation for you and I. And that's why there's been a former, and then there's always been a latter. So the end-time biblical blueprint is God's physical template to his spiritual fulfillment. 1917 to 1967. It is the 50-year Jubilee cycle pointing to the 120th Jubilee cycle, talking about the return of Jesus Christ. What do I mean by that? Well, you'd have to go back to some previous series that we did on the Shemitah cycles. And in the Shemitah cycles, we understand that all the way back from the time of Noah and the flood, where God says, I will not always strive with man, but 120 years. What does that bring us to? The 6,000-year cycle, the return of Jesus Christ. So from way back then, God has used that cycle to point us to the 120th cycle, the physical that precedes the shadow of the latter. The latter is the one that you or I in right now. So God gives us the physical that we can take today and look back the next cycle and understand where he's telling us today so that we make no mistake. That way somebody doesn't come along and say, oh, God told me, and bring you off in some left field out there and you have no idea and ignore the Bible. Why? Because, well, God told me. So now, here's the starting point. Isaiah 11:11. It shall come to pass that in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people. Now that tells us a lot of things, but I'm only going to start with just one right now. It tells you that when God comes back, that you and I are going to be in a state of bondage. How do you get around that? That's what it just told you right there. So when you think that you can go hide somewhere, you're in a state of bondage. Whether you're a slave or not, that's another story. But you're in the state of bondage. That means you're not totally free to do what God wants you to do, even though you are protected, like Daniel was. He was a slave. He was a captive. But he still obeyed God, and he still did what God told him to do. Now, we also know this, that the Bible gives us the former and the latter. You might be tired of hearing me say that, but there's no other way to explain this but understanding how the Bible is laid out. A former and a latter. It is important to remember that in the latter, now this is understood only in recent years, in the latter, God takes a physical to understand the spiritual. The physical helps us understand the former so that as you get to the spiritual, you have confirmation of what it is you're looking at because you just understood the physical. That's not double talk. That's facts. Also, we know that when covering end-time events, there must be a prophecy to point to for what we are to look for. You know, you just can't come out of your mind and say, well, it's got to be this because this is what I think. No. If you come into an end-time event, there's going to be a prophecy pointing to that. The physical confirms the prophecy that's in the former. And then you apply it to how it applies today in the spiritual. In this. Additionally, there will be something in the former events that will give us a clue as to the latter coming to pass. It's all connected. Everything is connected. Why? Because God laid his blueprint out. So in the blueprint, we come down to 2022, 2023, 2030, and now we go back, we roll our blueprint out, and now we're back into 1,000 years before Christ. And then in 1,000 years before Christ, you go through it and you go, there it is. And in that, you see there it is a prophecy that points to here it is now. How do we know it's here it is now? Because in the physical, it just showed us. Now you've got something to put it together with. Let me tell you what that does. It keeps you from going out in left field and trying to create something that you don't understand yet and try to apply it where it doesn't belong. You wait till God makes it clear. And he makes it clear by the confirmation from his holy word, not from your opinion. And that's why quite often I'll do my timelines and I'll put a question mark. It appears to be pointing to this, but we don't know. We have to wait and see. Now, moving further, the question. When was the first time God gathered his elect? See, if this was a Bible study, I'll go around the room and say everybody knows. I know you know this. But I know you just respect them, not jumping out and saying it. All right, let's go to the first time the elect. The children of Israel are in bondage in Egypt. That is the time God talks about the elect, that he had to go get them and bring them out. Because Isaiah 11 just said he's going to do it again. So what is it referring to the first time if you're going to do it again? The children of Israel. Isaiah 11:16 says, "And then there shall be a highway for the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, like it was to Israel in the day that they came out of Egypt." So there's your confirmation. I didn't have to give you my opinion. The Bible just told us when it is. You just had to go a few verses down. Boom, there it is. The Bible explains itself. The former event points us to the latter. So that means at the end time when Jesus Christ returns and this world's in absolute chaos, again, you don't have to fear, because why? He's coming back. Wherever he has placed you, he's coming to get you. That ought to be comforting to know that. Genesis 15:13 says this, "Know of a surety that your seed shall be a stranger in the land that is not theirs." Now, in the past, you think about that as like, I'm going to be in Germany, or I'll be in South Africa or South America or whatever. Now, let's think about this in a spiritual aspect. Does this country today look like it did 20 years ago? You're in a country that's not yours. You don't remember it, because this is the way it's been here in this nation. We live in a country we can't recognize anymore. There's what the Bible's telling you right there. You're thinking you got to be taken somewhere. And for decades I said, how in the world God's going to move 260 million people to another country? No, the country changes and you're in it. See that make sense? You say, wow, how come we didn't know that? Because it wasn't time yet. You didn't have the world events that you're facing today. You didn't look around the country that you're looking at today. It's like, how in the world can this be happening in the United States? Because why? Because you're in a country that's not yours anymore. It's been taken away from us. All right, let's go on. I know it's taking a long time to set up a sermon, huh? That's okay, it's a Bible study. Yeah. All right, let me go on. The former event points to the latter. Right? Genesis 15:13. Exodus 12 says this, "Shows the prophecy of the former coming to pass, and now the sojourn of the children of Israel dwelt in Egypt 430 years." So in the former, what we're looking for now, we got a specific. Here's a specific point we need to keep in mind. We know we're going to be gathered a second time. So if he's connecting us to the former, what's the specific point God brings out that we can look at the end time? There's got to be a connection to 430 years. So is there an end time coming to pass or fulfillment, a type, a template, a physical, that brings in 430 years? Oh, yes, there is. There's actually a couple. I'm going to talk about one today. 430 years. So now, what we're looking for now, all right, so we got being rescued a second time. We got 430 years. We're looking for a physical. We're building a blueprint. What we're doing is we're taking God's blueprint and we're starting to fill in the blanks as we go. That's all we're doing today. We're filling in the blanks. So what we're looking for is a period of time that a nation has a 430-year history that connects us to the prophecy of Genesis 15. Now, that would be fun if you're doing a Bible study. If you're online and you had a little small group and you're sitting around a table, do that. Sit around a table and say, let's go find a connection. And you will find it if you look hard enough. But I'm going to have to give it to you today, though. Otherwise, my message is over. All right, so it ties us to the ancient Israelites' bondage. It confirms the events through a specific prophecy of confirmation. See, there's a prophecy now that has to be confirmed that connects to 430 years. Going on. And it points us to the end-time duality of fulfillment of God's plan for the return of Jesus Christ. You see how important that 430 years all of a sudden became? It has to fulfill all of this. Otherwise, you take and you throw it out. It doesn't fit the blueprint. You Can't make it fit. It's like taking a square peg and putting it in a round hole. It don't work. So it's got to fit all of this, or it doesn't work. So, now the dates, 1917 to 1967. God's plan of salvation for 50 years. I just took 30 minutes to start answering the statement. But without giving you the background, you can't understand what you're about to look at. You'd understand it, but it would mean nothing to you. Because you have to understand how the Bible connects these years to it. So now when we begin connecting, you're going to connect the history to the Bible. And by the way, that's what we do with News Nuggets and Insights. And people seem to be connecting more and more that way. Because now they're living through the history, and they're putting together the biblical, spiritual principle under the pain, the suffering, the difficulties, the turmoil, the conflict that they're living through. Now we're ready. Now, I'm not going to build the whole timeline and confuse anybody. I actually sat together on last Wednesday, and I spent a whole day to put this together. And by the end of the day, I said, I can't even share that. Because even I had so much stuff there, I couldn't even understand what I was saying. So I'm going to take it real simple today. I'm going to build the background today. And next week, so this is called Bible Study 101. And next week we go to 102. Or 2 weeks, 102. Might even need 103, who knows. 1917. That's our starting point, right? April 6, 1917, the United States enters World War I. It's kind of interesting because you see when the Revelation, you talked about what's the thing happens, you go into war. Armageddon, all these things come together. It happened to be Passover. Isn't it amazing? The template starts the United States moving into a world war on the day of Passover. So wow. But as we studied this over the cycles of the last 8 years, we also understood something even more important that we didn't understand 8 years ago. At least I didn't. In the historical dates, it was a Sabbath, it was the 9th of Av, and it was your Shemitah cycle. Anytime you put these together, it's not good news. Hence, a world war that we actually just moved into. Same year, beginning September 27th, right after the fall holy days. Now, I don't know when I gave this, I didn't want to change these things, if that was atonement or trumpets. When I first started doing these, I accepted what was currently understood as the atonement or the new cycle of the 7 years that began on trumpets. But as I studied over the years, I couldn't find trumpets coordinating with the new cycles. Atonement does. Because atonement is the year of release. Atonement starts to get over. Trumpets begin the foundation of the new kingdom with Jesus Christ coming back. So that's why they aligned the new cycles to trumpets. It's also the civil year for the nation of Israel. So that's where they begin. So anyway, it's the fall holy days, September 27th. So the next 7 years cycle began in September 27th, 1917. All right, so we had just entered into the war about 6 months earlier. At sunset on December 17th, at the end of the 8th, moving into sunset, on God's calendar begins a new day, begins the fig tree season. We can confirm this. Let me tell you why and how. I'm going to begin to show you that now. Because once we've got this, we got our blueprint to begin to lay out. And now we just start moving forward. We have to have a starting point, and we have to have a conclusion point. This begins the starting point. All right, so December 8th, 1917, what was important about that day? Well, on that day, you can go back, and this is from the Day of the Lord series. It's online. I think it's a 4-part series, and you need to go see each one of them. But I'm going to only bring out one point in that series. On the evening of December 8th, and through the daytime portion of the 9th, everything in Jerusalem changed. Let's talk about that. Here is the prophecy. Remember I told you there has to be a prophecy that points to a time that must be confirmed. Here it is. It's in Haggai. Haggai points to what's called the 24th day of the 9th month. So in December 1917, the 24th day of the 9th month is December 9th. December 9th. Why is that important? Well, let me show you. In that day, there's 3 times God comes to him and says, on this day. And he specifically says what the day is. Now, what you're looking here is 18 and 20. I put those in now because I don't want to change the past to try to justify if we were wrong. If we taught something that was wrong, I want to keep it the way it was. But what I did is I copied and pasted certain things, and if I forgot to change the scripture, so you see the 10th and all of them. So I put the 18th and the 20th verse. Same chapter, it just was a typo. So now, when you look at this, what is God telling us that's being confirmed on this day that was prophesied by Haggai? So we began looking at that. The very first thing is this. In the 20th verse, God says, I will shake the heavens and the earth. He's telling this to Haggai. Because many theologians believe that this prophecy was fulfilled in the Old Testament of the building of the temple. He said, no, that's done. That's been accomplished. Only the former. Because this verse has not been completed. Let's go on. I will overthrow the thrones of the kingdoms. Has that accomplished? No. So Haggai is pointing forward to the end time of Jesus' return. What he's given us is a ladder physical to understand what's going to happen at the end time. All right, so he says, I will overthrow the thrones of the kingdoms. I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms. I will overthrow the chariots, the horses, and their riders, and every one by the sword of his brother. That has not been fulfilled. It's only been fulfilled in type in the Old Testament. It's been fulfilled in physical latter in 1917. How do we know that? Here's what we know because of verse 18. Let's go to verse 18. He says, is the seed in the barn yet? They just coming out of basically captivity. The temple's destroyed. And he's like, no, there's no seed in the barn. You go through the entire chapter, and you'll see that there's no seed in the barn. The vines aren't growing. There's no fig tree. There's no pomegranate or olive trees. Then none of them is brought forth. But God says, from the day I begin to fulfill this prophecy, I will begin to bless you. Now keep this in mind. I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes. From the time this prophecy goes out, he's going to bless you. What else is he going to do? He said it's the beginning of the building of his temple. He said, before I lay a stone in the rebuilding, from the day I start, it's not going to stop. Well, there's no temple being built in 1917. Yes, there was. The temple was the physical, pointing us to what? The temple inside of you. So what God was showing us in this physical template, his spirit being laid in man, he begins from the day he fulfills this prophecy, it points forward. Now, you pull another scripture in that I'm not going to use today, but I'll tell you about it from Hezekiah. Remember when Hezekiah showed the king Babylon all his riches? And God says, you never should have done that. Now they're going to come take it from you. It was a prophecy of 100 years. What happened 100 years later from 1917 to 2017? Can anybody think of anything in 2017? I know there's a couple of you will. The heavenly signs. The alignment of Revelation 12. So you have a confirmation pointing it forward, the former and the latter, even in that. So now we're looking at, on the December 9th, the General Allenby, marches in to Jerusalem. It's actually marched in, I think, the 10th or 11th. It was 3 days later. But what happened on the day of the 9th is what I want to bring out here. All right, from the 17th, now we're going through our cycles. 38 began to attacking the Jews in a Kristallnacht, actually taking over other nations. 1945 with the end of the war. Now we go through all of our cycles to, there's our 7 sevens to 1967. All right, now we have our 50 years. Now, let's go through and begin, put together just a couple of things. I'm not going to put everything together today. I just want to lay the foundation. You with me so far? All right. So now, 1917, the events in Jerusalem, 1907, as foretold in the Bible. Jerusalem, December 1917. This was from a writing from back in that day. The atmosphere was electric as General Allenby dismounted his horse in humility. He removed his hat in reverence and entered into the walls of the old city through the Jaffa Gate, which hadn't been used for many years. Muslim rule was over. How many years did Muslims rule Jerusalem? 400 years. But we're looking for 430, remember? That's just 400 years. The nation of Israel and the UN put forth the paper to establish the nation of Israel 30 years later. So we have now, we're looking in the right spot. On our blueprint, we can go to 430 years, we got something. We got a scripture that confirms that we're in the right area on the blueprint. Now we need to put together the events. The Muslim rule was over. Iconic footage shows the Jewish people welcoming him in as he was some type of what? A Messiah. Isn't it interesting how it's written even back then? Because we're talking about in type Jesus Christ coming back, standing on the Mount of Olives. A triumphant entry. You see how it's putting together? What's going on here? All right. And the land was never the same again. And when Jesus Christ comes back, it will never be the same again. So now we got, I said, wow, you connecting this now? I said, wow, see what God did here? He laid out the story in the Old Testament. He lived the type to the children of Israel. He pointed to the future. And now we're looking back and say, listen, we're going to live through this. We're going to be in the same event, you and I, but we're going to be spirit beings going through all of this. I don't know how excited you get about that, but you can say I am. That God took the time because of his love for you and I so we don't fail. Remember 1 Corinthians 10? Why did God lay all this out? So we don't make the same mistakes. So we don't make the same mistakes. After other Muslim conquests had come and gone, the Turkish Ottomans conquered and ruled over Jerusalem, what was then in Palestine, for 400 years. In the Bible, 400 years seem to be a bit of a byword for slavery and oppression. 400 years of Canaanite sin stored up the wrath for 400 years of slavery was in Egypt. So there seemed to be 400 years. Every time it was like it was a curse or a bondage. And here we have 400 years of the Ottoman rule. So now our blueprint, we're filling our blueprint in now. It's starting to lay out really nice. It looks like we're connecting to what God wants us to understand for our time. There was an Arab saying back then, 1917, that the Turks will not leave Jerusalem until the river Nile flows in Palestine and the prophet expels them from the city. In other words, God himself is going to have to come down and take me out of this city. I'm going to say this. I probably shouldn't say this. We heard that from President Biden, says, God is going to have to take me out of this. Well, he's out. I couldn't help that. Because it upsets me when people try to use God as their witness when they're sinning before God and going to bring curses upon a nation. But anyways, I know I probably shouldn't have said that, but it came to my mind and so I already thought it. So going on. Remarkably enough, though, events conspired to bring these two highly unlikely things to pass. The two things, the water would have to come from the Nile into the city, which is a physical impossibility before it actually happened. You had to make that happen. So now, as the Turks, I'm going to tell you about that book in just a second. As the Turks were allied with Germany in the First World War, The British found themselves fighting against invading the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. General Allenby was charged with liberating Jerusalem and had expressed concern to his superiors about the magnitude and the sensitivity of his task. Because here's what they told him he had to do. After 400 years, in the middle of a world war, you have to go take the city without firing on the people or the city. How in the world do you do that? I had a paper, I left it in my briefcase, and it's kind of long, and I probably wouldn't even have time to read it. But let me just briefly tell you what it is. He found his answer in his book. That book was written in 1898, before there was an airplane. The Wright brothers hadn't even built an airplane yet. So now, when he first wrote it, here's what he has. General Allenby came across the Bible scholar, D.H. Aldersmith, who has been studying the prophecies regarding Israel. Aldersmith explained that in his book in 1898, The Fullness of the Nations, that he believed Jerusalem was going to be delivered by Great Britain in 1917. God had led him to that. General Allenby believed that he was going to be part of that prophetic fulfillment. And that's why he got all the cameras ready. That's why he's got the armies ready. And he went and he became convinced, this was Aldersmith, from Isaiah 31, that the UK would have a part to play in the restoration of Jerusalem, and that would be accomplished by some kind of flying machine. He read that. God directed him to that book. God gave Aldersmith the understanding of the prophecy in the Old Testament, and he pinpointed the exact time and year when that was going to take place. Allenby, understanding that, he wrote a note, and they planted up thousands of leaflets, and on the night of the 8th, they had a plane fly over the city and threw out all the leaflets, telling the Turks they had to leave. And it was written up, and it looked like it came from their God. It scared the Turks because by that time, Great Britain had already brought water to the city, according to that Nile River. And this was the second of their belief that something had flown over, and they were being told to get out of the city. By the morning of the 9th, the city was empty. 2 days later, Allenby walks in, and all the films of what you see is history. The very next morning, on the 9th, the mayor of the city came walking out as Allenby came into the city with a white flag. That white flag and those pictures are in the museum today of that event. And so they went in without firing a shot, and Jerusalem was taken back. So you and I are not going to fire a shot when Jesus Christ comes back. Jesus is going to do the battle. Amazing story. So when you look at all those things, the biblical confirmation, the timing of a 50-year period, the location of where it's all at, the nations of who we're dealing with, the 400 years leading to the 430, it all lines up. The blueprint now is being written right in front of our very eyes. So now let's take a look just right quick like. These are the physical events over the years that came through during these cycles, which I'm going to get into next time. You may have seen them before, but now we're going to bring out some spiritual significance into it next time. Each one of these cycles have a very important purpose because they tie into the cycle that you and I live today. Like 1952. Why did God have this war end in 1945? Because you see, by 1952, there's enough nuclear weaponry to destroy the entire planet. In the end time, spiritual principle says God's going to cut time short. If not, no flesh would be saved. In the physical type, you've got that right here. So the war ends in 45 because it began the nuclear age. And if that had kept going for another 7 years, we could have destroyed the whole planet. The physical type points to the time you and I live today. One thing more comes out is God's confirmation from the heavens, the blood moon tetrads. So you see by 49 and 50, the blood moon tetrads. It says, unless time was cut short, no flesh would be saved. So what God's showing us, he had a hand in this. He was bringing it to pass. But you also have confirmation of something in 67 with the blood moon tetrads. Well, we know looking back now, it was pretty easy to understand. It was the 6-day war and taking over Jerusalem. So you have the rest of the cycles, your 6 and 7. In this cycle here, 59, the United States comes to its greatest strength. 50 states, picturing 50. From that period, another prophecy begins to unwind. From that period to 2024, a 65-year decline for the United States in prophecy. Connected into this physical, the spiritual begins right there. Then, of course, you have the Jubilee, which is 67, the timeline of the events and taking over Jerusalem. And here you see in 1967, Israel takes control of Jerusalem. On that day, the feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives in type. It was interesting, and I'll tell you what brought me to understand all of this, is as I was going through this, it was the 6-day war. So I said, the 6-day war in the 50th year, it couldn't be a 7th-day war, because see, in the 7th day, it's the millennium in type. So there had to be peace. So when Jesus Christ comes back in type, that 7th day, the millennial reign, there's peace. There's no war. So even in the microcosm of the full 50 to the small, it fits perfectly into the blueprint. Something else that we can look at. Now, let's put together, just real fast now, let's line up the years that we have today. Here's the cycle of the 50 years that you and I live today. We believe what we're looking at here is the final Shemitah cycle before the return of Jesus Christ. Here we have the 7. And in the 7, everything is built around God's plan on the 7s. I mean, that's not a secret to anybody. But now we've got these 7s all lining up that point to God's plan of salvation. You have the former, 7,000 years. You have the latter, physical. And you have the latter, spiritual. All perfectly aligned to the 7s. We have God showing us his interventions in 49 and 50, and in 67, 68. We see right here in 2015, we see the blood moon tetrads. That's the 8th since Christ, meaning a new beginning. So when we look at this, we know we have confirmation of God doing something pointing forward because we have a new beginning come in. Now we have our 7,000 years, which aligns to our 7 days. But there's an 8th day. The Feast of Tabernacles as the last great day. Right? What are we looking at? Let's put this to days of the week. All right, the Sabbath is always the 7th day. The next day is Sunday, which is the first day of the next week. So it's a Sunday. So now we have our days, we have our weeks, we have our years, we have 1,000 years. We have a former, we have a latter physical and a latter spiritual. It all lines up perfectly. Now let's put something together here. Jesus' first coming. In 1945, what happened in 1945? The war ended. Hitler was a type of Satan, just like Pharaoh was in the Old Testament. In the type, Satan is defeated. Here, 2015, I put a question mark on what I'm about to tell you. Is this the event where Satan is thrown out of heaven? Like it's over for him. It's done. Woe to you down on earth. Do you think the planet's changed since 2015? Oh, yeah. It's a mess. He said he's going after the elect. So little by little, you see more and more persecution going after. You're seeing laws that are changing now. You see government officials are taking over offices. And what's the first thing they want to do? Get them rotten Christians out of here. You know, even the mothers of all these children trying to bring Christ into our school. How dare they? Want to put them in jail. All is lining up. So you have the types lining up. Why? That's the 4th. He came in the 4,000th year at the beginning. He was crucified in the middle of the week. He's crucified, and here you have in the middle of the cycle. Again, the blueprint. When God laid it out, he put it out there. He said, nope, I got to move this over a little bit here. Let's line that up. Okay, now it's all lined up. And not only that, he takes world events and he aligns them to his spiritual prophecies before the world was created. Taking millions of people, billions of people, lining up the nations, moving where he wants. Why? Because he's got a blueprint. When God says, somebody tells me, God don't have a timeline. I dare say he does. It's called the appointed time, and it's built into a blueprint. It's built into a blueprint. And what God shows you in his blueprint is him, his personality, his type, his understanding. You show his love for you and I, of how he's laid it all out so that you don't fail, to give you comfort. No matter who wins this election, it doesn't matter for you and I at this point. It matters, don't get me wrong. But God's in charge is what I'm trying to say. And so whatever God wants to happen when that election comes at the end of this year, it's in God's plan. Rest assured, God is in charge. May not be the outcome we want. Maybe it is. But whatever it is, God's in charge. And you need to accept whatever happens because God is in charge. So now we come to the second coming. At the beginning of 6,000 years, the millennial reign comes in. Until the 7,000th year. He rules and reigns for 1,000 years. Now here's that confuses people. In the physical, the next year, they took over Jerusalem from 66 to 67. But you see, our cycle here is, we're in 29. We got another whole 7 years. They only had 1 year. Why is that different? Because you're in the spiritual cycle. This cycle starts with you and I in his end time plan. And it ends where? Here. It ends way out here. The new heaven and the new earth. You see this last 7-year cycle, 29 to 36? Christ is going to come back before that cycle is completed. And it doesn't finish till after the millennium and the new heaven and new earth comes. So that's why you have 2036. So that's why when you look at the timelines, there's always a 2036 on there, and people have been writing in and says, what is this 2036? It doesn't end, our cycle doesn't end with Christ coming, because you're just beginning the 1,000 years. You see, it doesn't end, it begins. It begins to come to completion. And at the end of that cycle, the end of millennium reign, the 100-year period, the new heaven and new earth, the 8th day. Because, see, we're going to be spirit beings. The old earth is gone. We're going to jump on a new one. You know, you don't miss. You don't want to miss. Long drop. Being silly. But that's what it is. This is the blueprint. And you're living through the blueprint right now. So now let's go through this real quick. I'm going to show you something. How this stuff lines up. I just want to give you 2 examples right now. And then I'm going to come back next week. In 1924, Adolf Hitler made his first run. It's like Satan taking his first attack to run Germany. He failed. In the spiritual, the Muslims come after America. Their first attack was the Twin Towers. They failed. See the failure? Same cycles, both fails. The next cycle, 1931, he takes power. In fact, this book's written in 1931, how he began his rise to power. Now, he takes total control in 33. But in 31, he began to rise to power. The Nazi groups, the Nazi government had control, had the majority of the people in the seats in Germany. So what happened in our next cycle? The towers fell. See the two? See how they're aligning? You can go through these and begin to line up these cycles as you go through them. Now, you can't make this up. These are historical events. You can't change that. Although people want to change it, like the Holocaust never happened. How in the world can I be teaching the Holocaust never happened? So now, let's go on. Now, I'm going to begin wrapping it up right here now. I'm going to take a few slides, and I won't take it real long. But now I'm going to go back to a scripture that I showed you earlier. I told you we're going to come back to. Conditions entering the kingdom. When the land that Great Britain took back in 1917. All right, this is Mark Twain. Mark Twain toured the land of Israel in the 1800s. By the way, I'm going to use this for the feast too, because I want to talk about the millennial reign and the feast. Mark Twain began to rule, took his pictures in the 1800s. Now, remember I told you I'm going to come back to Haggai? Now we're back in Haggai. He said, is the seed yet in the barn? Yet is the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranates, the olive tree has not brought forth. From this day I will bless you. So now what we're looking at here is that what God said in the prophecy that he began to fulfill December 9th, Haggai's words said this was going to happen. From the day that he began, he's not going to stop. And he said, at that time when you came in, do you have any blessings yet? And they said, no. He said, from this day forward, you will. From 1917, let me show you now. Mark Twain, look what he says. He said, this is a hopeless and a dreary and a broken-hearted land. The pictures that he had. He said, Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. It broods and spells out like a curse. And it withers in its fields and fettered in its energies. Yet they were cursed. They were under bondage for 400 years. He said, it's a desolate country whose soil seems rich enough. But he said, it's wholly given over to weeds. He said, it's a silent and a mournful expanse. He said, a desolation is here that not even imagination with grace and with pomp of life in action. Pre-1917. Isn't it amazing? That's what Israel looked like. That's what the land had become. It reminds you in type of the earth. In Genesis 1:1, and it says, and the earth had become void and dark and desolate. There was nothing left to it. Satan had brought it to absolute destruction. There was nothing left to it. He's trying to again. God's not going to let him happen this time. But then, 1917, post-1917, Israel today, restoring the land. Take a look at this. Same lands. Look what Israel has done. Look what God has done through Israel. Why? Because that 50-year cycle, that 50-year type, it has to carry through. It didn't stop in 1967. It had to fulfill the type of the millennial reign from 67 on. That's what you're looking at here. So you're looking at the world when Christ comes back. When he takes over, it's going to look like pre-1917. When he leaves, it's going to look like this, except even much more beautiful than ever. He said, look at this now. A fruitful land of a redeemed nation. This is out of Israel, my glory. Look at these lands. Look what Israel has done to the lands that are over there. And even now they can try to do more, and they even produce water and bring the other nations in the middle of this arid desert lands that's over there. The lakes are drying up everywhere, and Israel pumps water from the Mediterranean as a solution. In Isaiah 43:19, God says that he would do that. Israel now takes these desalinization plants, massive plants, takes the water out and gives them fresh water. And they sell it and they give it to the nations who are trying to destroy them. Right now. He says, I will make a way in the wilderness and in the rivers and in the desert. Getting ahead of the crisis is what they said, because you see, they knew that there'd be droughts coming. The Bible foretells there will be droughts at the end time. So, and the beasts of the field shall honor me, God says, and the dragons and the owls, because I give waters in the wilderness and rivers in the desert, and I give my drink to my people, my chosen. That's the type. Jesus Christ says, if any man thirst, let him come to me. This is the physical. Jesus Christ is the spiritual. This is where God is taking us right now. So what are we looking at here? Look at Isaiah 35. The wilderness and the celerity is placed shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice, God says, and the blossoms as a rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and with singing. And the glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon, and they shall see the glory of the Lord and the excellency of our God. Strengthen you with the weak hands, and confirm the weeble knees. And say to them that are of a fearful heart, be strong. Fear not, behold, your God comes with vengeance, and even God with a recompense. He will save you. And the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. The lame man shall leap as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. In the wilderness of the water shall break out with streams in the desert, God says. And the parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water, and the habitation of dragons where each lay shall be grass with the weeds and the rushes. And the highway shall be there, and a way, and it shall be called the way of holiness. And the unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for those, the wayfaring men, though fools shall not err therein. And no lion shall be there, no ravenous beast shall be thereupon, and it shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return, and they come unto Zion with songs with everlasting joy. And upon their heads they shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. This is Isaiah 35. When you look at the lands of Israel, what they were trying to establish, that is the physical type, what God wants us to understand for his plan for you. And it is laid out in God's plan, his blueprint for the end time church. That is you. And I will pick up this story when I speak in 2 weeks.